Hi everyone, it's good to see you all. I'm actually recording this on a Monday afternoon instead of a Wednesday. And it's my first time, I believe, ever teaching an audience that isn't with me. So bear with me. It's probably going to be a little awkward at times, but we'll figure it out together. So here goes. I do have a little audience. I had to remind myself of who else was watching me, so over in the corner here, see if I can show them to you. There they are. Here. We've got a little cow for the Brewbakers, a little snowman just because it's July, and I believe this was from Mary Kay Weaver when the twins were born. A little owl to remind me of Trisha, a teddy bear for my kids, and just a little British bear. That one's for you, Deb, I guess. So anyway, if I'm looking at somewhere besides the computer, it's probably them I'm looking at. Anyway, it is good to be teaching, and I hope you guys learn a little bit of what I learned. You know, the teacher always gets a little more out of it, but yeah, God's word is eternal. So before we get started, I think I'll just go ahead and pray like I always do. We can join right in. Lord, we thank you so much for your word, for the lessons you teach us through it, for the character that you reveal of yourself through it. Thank you for not giving up on us, for keeping your covenant, even though so many times we prove unfaithful. And so God, I pray that as we study your word this week and dig into it and do our best to learn from it, I pray that you would open our hearts, that you would speak to us. And God, I pray that as I teach from it, that I would be faithful to your word, because it's your word that's eternal. All of us just fade away like grass. So speak to us tonight and change us. Help us not to walk away the same. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. So jumping right in, I think we had missed a couple chapters last week because there was a different video shown. So I'm not going to teach on all of the chapters, obviously. 5's enough to cover. I wasn't going to try 10. But we will, especially with Exodus, we'll go over a little bit of recapping because just to keep caught up with the story. So last week would have been Exodus 3 and 4. And what went on in those chapters was Moses' burning bush experience. That's where it started. So he meets with God and gets to experience this miracle. And God calls him to a task that Moses wants nothing to do with. So he gives lots of excuses and tries to wiggle his way out of it. And eventually God gets pretty mad at him and basically makes a concession. I'll send Aaron with you, but you're not off the hook. You're still doing it. So that is the burning bush. The Lord gives Moses some signs to show the Israelites so that they would believe Moses, that he came from God. And so then Moses meets up with Aaron. They go back to Egypt, and the Lord gives Aaron the commission as well and tells him what to do. So that's where we pick up in Exodus 5. So Moses and Aaron had actually gone to see the Israelites and had performed these signs, and when the Israelites heard that the Lord was concerned about them and had seen their misery, they bowed down and worshipped. So they did believe right away. So that was encouraging, I'm sure, right off the bat to Moses. But then we jump into chapter 5, so here we go. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the desert." And when I read this, I thought, I have always wondered if God actually meant for them to just take a 3-day festival into the desert, or if this is just a way for them to get like a 3-day head start on the Egyptian army, right? But there are a couple things that make me think that's probably not the case. First of all, because God usually doesn't use deception in order to accomplish his purposes. So I think he probably was just asking for a festival at this point. But I had to think, why did he do it that way? And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, I think probably he was giving Pharaoh a chance. And he was giving him a little window of freedom. And if Pharaoh would have granted it, maybe he would have pushed for more. And gradually that way, gotten him to see that slavery was not a good option, that he wanted his people back. So just as we go through the story, a lot of the judgments on Egypt seem pretty harsh. But there's an awful lot of chances that Pharaoh had to get out of it. God didn't just, boom, once you're done, and after that you get all my judgment, and there's nothing you can do about it. Pharaoh had lots of chances to turn around, and the Egyptian people did too. So anyway, so here's chance number one. But of course Pharaoh's response is, Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." And why should he, right? But he's about to get to know God, maybe a little better than he wants to. Then they said, Moses and Aaron, "The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Now let us take a 3-day journey into the desert to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God, or he may strike us with plagues or the sword." Now, a couple things about this. First of all, 3-day journey. Why did they want it? It spells it out in Exodus 8, actually. Exodus 8:26. Moses says, "That would not be right. The sacrifices we offer the Lord our God would be detestable to the Egyptians. And if we offer sacrifices that are detestable in their eyes, will they not stone us?" So they were actually, it seems, concerned for their lives because the differences in worship were so different. And yeah, people did take their religion very seriously. Human sacrifice was a real thing. Another thing that I wanted to bring out was that Moses and Aaron mentioned, he may strike us with plagues or the sword. There's no evidence that God said this. We don't know if that was just an assumption on their part. It is true that the gods of those days were very wrathful. If you crossed them, you could expect to be struck with plagues or the sword or some other equally terrible result. So it was not incomprehensible that they would have expected this. If they didn't obey God, this is what they were getting. And frankly, I'm not sure a little more of that kind of fear wouldn't benefit us. We're so hyper-focused on grace right now that it's hard for us to really get back to justice. But without justice, there really isn't grace. So just a thought to keep in the back of your head. God had not necessarily promised that they would get this, but this is what Moses and Aaron are thinking. This is a possibility. So, moving on. The king of Egypt said, "Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from their labor? Get back to your work." Then Pharaoh said, "Look, the people of the land are now numerous, and you're stopping them from working." Translation, "You're costing me a lot of money, and I don't appreciate it." That same day, Pharaoh gave this order to the slave drivers and foremen in charge of the people. "You are no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw. But require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota. They're lazy. That's why they're crying out, 'Let us go and sacrifice to our God.' Make the work harder for the men so that they keep working and pay no attention to lies." Now, this is a very common attitude in people that have been in positions of power for a long time. What is it? Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It is it's a dangerous thing to give a person power over somebody else. And it always has kind of struck me funny that that's how God often grows us up. He gives us power over tiny little human beings. And yeah, it's a big responsibility, and it's dangerous at times. So Pharaoh's response is the typical response of a tyrant. And you can think of, this happened with Israelite kings too. I can think of Rehoboam right off the top of my head. People were complaining, and he said, "Oh, they must not, they're not under a strong enough whip." And all his advisors were saying, yep, just crack down on them harder. So that's what he did, and it ended up having disastrous effects. But the correct response when somebody is complaining is not to write it off, and it's not to accept it as gospel. It's to evaluate it and see, do they have a point here? Can they be expected to make the same number of bricks if they're now collecting straw as well? And if you're a parent, your kids come to you with unreasonable requests sometimes, and you still have to say no. It's not to say that every request should be granted, but the first response should always be, is it a legitimate concern? Am I ruling correctly? Am I using my authority for the good of everyone? So, that's a caution for me as a parent. But Pharaoh, as I said, had been in power for a long time. The pharaohs were actually in Egypt considered to be gods, very much like the Roman Caesars or emperors. They were considered to be a god in a divine form, and that's how they were basically worshipped that way. So you ascribe that kind of power to any human, and it's going to have ill effects. So then the slave drivers and the foremen went out and said to the people, the foremen would have been Israelites. This is interesting. The slave drivers and the foremen went out and said to the people, this is what Pharaoh says. I will not give you any more straw. Go and get your own straw wherever you can find it, but your work will not be reduced at all. So the people scattered all over Egypt to gather stubble to use for straw. The slave drivers kept pressing them, saying, complete the work required of you for each day, just as when you had straw. The Israelite foremen appointed by Pharaoh's slave drivers were beaten and were asked, why didn't you meet your quota of bricks yesterday or today as before? So 2 days in, they're finding out this isn't just an off-the-cuff command. We're going to be punished for this if we don't actually meet our quota. So what do? They go to Pharaoh. The Israelite foremen went and appealed to Pharaoh, why have you treated your servants this way? Your servants are given no straw, yet we are told make bricks. Your servants are being beaten, but the fault is with your own people. Now, is the fault with the Egyptians? I mean, they're not standing up to the oppression. But I think probably they wanted to say the fault is with you, and they just can't say it because he's a god, right? You don't confront somebody like that and expect to get a good response when you say it's your fault. So Pharaoh said, lazy, that's what you are, lazy. That is why you keep saying, let us go and sacrifice to the Lord. Now get to work. You will not be given any straw, yet you must produce your full quota of bricks. The Israelite foremen realized they were in trouble when they were told, you're not to reduce the number of bricks required of you for each day. When they left Pharaoh, they found Moses and Aaron waiting to meet them, and they said, may the Lord look upon you and judge you. You have made us a stench to Pharaoh and his officials, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us. Not the response they wanted. Not the response Moses and Aaron wanted. Certainly not the response the Israelites wanted. And all of a sudden, Moses and Aaron did exactly what God asked and brought more suffering on the people they were trying to help. So it's a classic case of tyranny, right? And this has been repeated in human history for centuries. I remember in the book Boundaries, which we studied as a Sunday school class, the doctors talk about how if you confront a wrong that's being done, generally, the first thing that's going to happen is it's going to get worse. And the person that's confronted, of course, doesn't appreciate it. They don't appreciate their power being questioned, and they don't appreciate not receiving whatever they were receiving from the oppression. And that's why often people don't confront oppression or any sort of wrong. That you do risk loss. And sometimes it's just easier to accept little bits of loss over a long period of time rather than to risk losing everything or what feels like everything. But God has commanded, and they did it, and so something should happen, right? It should be all better. They obeyed God. It should be better. And it's not. So, of course, the Israelites go back to Moses and Aaron, like, we wish you had never come, right? And so Moses, how does he respond? Well, he does the right thing. Moses returned to the Lord and said, O Lord, why have you brought trouble upon this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he's brought trouble upon this people, and you have not rescued your people at all. Now, maybe he's not exhibiting the strongest faith here, that God is going to fulfill his promises, but at least he's not commiserating with the Israelites. He's not just complaining. He's not turning his back and saying, that's it, I give up. He goes to God and he says, why is this happening? Please tell me, I want to know. And so God responds. And this is the best part of the whole 2 chapters. Then the Lord said to Moses, now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Because of my mighty hand, he will let them go. Because of my mighty hand, he will drive them out of his country. Not only will he let them go, he will push them out. He will want them to be gone. God also said to Moses, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty. But by my name, the Lord, I did not make myself known to them. So this is the new name, and it did come up a little bit in 3 or 4, I forget which. But it is the new name, and so I looked into it a little bit. This name, the Lord, in Hebrew would be the Yahweh name. It's often translated as Yahweh. It's actually just 4 consonants because the Hebrew alphabet is that way. But it's YHWH, which is usually translated as Yahweh. And we don't know what it means. We have never really figured out if there's a true Hebrew meaning to the word. There are some guesses and some educated guesses. I think the one I found that I thought probably made the most sense was the one who brings into being. So kind of a creator name. But anyway, so this is a new name, the Lord. And actually, most practicing Jews would still refuse to even say this name out loud or write it down, at least in its entirety. They might write some of the letters, but they wouldn't write the whole thing because it's that holy. It is the name that God gave himself and to Moses. So, by my name, the Lord, I did not make myself known to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, where they lived as aliens. In other words, not as the rightful owners of the land, but just as servants or slaves. Moreover, I have heard the groaning of the Israelites, whom the Egyptians are enslaving, and I have remembered my covenant. I haven't forgotten you. Therefore, say to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. And I will bring you to the land I swore with uplifted hand to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord. Moses reported this to the Israelites, but they did not listen to him because of their discouragement and cruel bondage. You remember, even before this enslavement, they were being extremely oppressed. So you can imagine how they're feeling now. This is almost intolerable. Then the Lord said to Moses, Go, tell Pharaoh king of Egypt to let the Israelites go out of his country. Again. But Moses said to the Lord, If the Israelites will not listen to me, why would Pharaoh listen to me, since I speak with faltering lips? A note here, often I've heard the faltering lips being ascribed to a stuttering problem or some sort of speech impediment. Based on I think there's Acts 7:22. I'm not 100% sure that's the case. Acts 7:22 says, Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. So it's interesting how our self-perceptions sometimes vary from reality, or how other people perceive us, or certainly how God perceives us. But he often uses this faltering lips phrase, and most of the commentaries seem to think that it was probably more because he felt like he wasn't eloquent enough. He didn't know what to say. You get before a person who is just about all-powerful. And what do you say? How do you just say, let my people go? That starts to get pretty old, right? You start to sound pretty dumb. So I speak with faltering lips. Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron about the Israelites and Pharaoh king of Egypt, and he commanded them to bring the Israelites out of Egypt. These were the heads of their families, and then it goes through all of them. I'm not going to read through them all because I'm just going to butcher all the names. But one thing that I did pull out that was pretty interesting to me was that Moses is the great-grandson of Levi. So there's only 4 generations. That is Levi, right? Not grandson of Levi. Goodness. Yes. So 4 generations. And now I have no place in here. So it went from, Joseph to Levi to Kohath to Amram to Moses and Aaron. And that's all it took for the entire race of the Israelites to become enslaved. Obviously, they weren't in Joseph's time. They probably weren't Levi obviously would have been the same age as Joseph. So they weren't in Levi's time. maybe not even in his son's time, but by the time it got to Moses, they were extremely oppressed. So that was interesting to me. All right, so that is just about the end of the Exodus portion of our study. A couple things that I wanted to pull out, especially at the end here. There's a lot of times that we look at the Old Testament and we almost view God as a God of judgment in the Old Testament, and he's a God of mercy in the New Testament when Jesus comes. And I don't think that's the case. But I do think that for God to reveal himself as a God of mercy as well as justice, he had to first teach justice. You can't even understand what grace is until you know there are things that are terribly wrong, and I do them often and repeatedly. And I deserve the wages of sin, death. I deserve that. And so often when we look at the Old Testament, we start to feel like that's all God is. And it is. I mean, it is a true part of his character. It's something we can't forget, and I think we're in danger of it. God is a God of justice. He doesn't take it lightly when we commit sins against other people and against him. It's not something he can just overlook. And I think you do begin to understand this when you become a parent. You know, I don't want my kids to be the kind of people that treat other people that way, right? And I would rather have them be unhappily righteous than happily unrighteous, if that makes sense. I would rather see them do the right thing and suffer for it than to become the next Hitler and be happy the whole time. Not that either choice is great, but I mean, you'd rather see them do the right thing and be happy too, right? But it is important to realize that love requires justice as well. You can't have one without the other. So that is one thing, and you know, it's not that God changed, but he does reveal more of himself throughout Scripture as it goes on, and even beyond Scripture. I think sometimes we're really cautious about saying God spoke to me or something like that. And it is, you got to watch it, you know. Sometimes it's our own spirit saying something, and when we should be listening to God's spirit instead. You have to be really careful about that. But as long as it lines up with his character in his word, we should be expecting God to reveal more of himself to us. That's one of the great things about God, because we'll never come to the end of knowing him. You know, we're gonna spend 1,000 years and more getting to God in heaven, and we'll never come to the end of it. It's not like you ever get to know everything there is to know about God. It's what makes a relationship with him fascinating. So anyway, some more revelation. One more thing I wanted to bring out was Moses' repeated question, why would Pharaoh listen to me? And God never really says Pharaoh is going to listen to you. He says, I'm going to do something. And you have to tell him to listen, but he won't. And so often when God tells us to do something, we take responsibility for the results. And that's not at all what we are supposed to do. You know, we are called to obey God, and that's it. And we don't get to decide what happens after that. Sometimes people will listen, sometimes they won't. Sometimes prophets got thrown in a well and killed, and other times Israel repented and returned to God. And you know, we are responsible for what God has called us to do. So as we think about Exodus, I just want to ask you a question. I'm going to give you a little bit of time to think about, and then we'll move on. But my question is, what is God telling me to do that I just don't want to, that I want to give excuses for? What's he telling me to do today? And as you think about it, I'll tell just a short story. Most of the things that God has told me to do, you never want to do them, or God wouldn't have to tell you, right? So I think most of the things that I've had to do have involved some sort of apology. It's a making right of something that I did wrong before. And so there have been times that I put it off for years. I can think of two instances in particular where God told me to do something, and I knew He was telling me, and I just kept putting it off, Didn't want to do it. And if God's telling you to do something today, you're probably not going to want to do it. But you know what? It was really difficult. But the two times that I'm thinking of, when I did it, it was incredibly freeing, and it brings you to a new level in your relationship with God, because it helps you to trust Him. You know, looking back now, I'm like, why didn't I do it before? Why did I have to wait so long? It just seems silly. And so there are definite rewards to obedience, and there's growth that doesn't happen unless you obey. Trust and obey, right? The old song. So I want you to think of what God wants you to do today, and do it. All right, now, like I said, I didn't give you much time to think, but moving on to Psalms. I'm sure you can think about it later if you want. Psalms 57 and 58 were the chapters for this week. Psalm 57 is written to the tune of Do Not Destroy, which is a pretty common tune for a bunch of David's psalms. Kind of makes me wonder how the music actually went. But we don't know. It is written by David, and it is when he had fled from Saul into the cave. So just to give you the backstory, I'm going to go back to 1 Samuel 24 and just read the first couple verses to give you the background. After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. He came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave. The men said, This is the day the Lord spoke of, when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. Then David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And then I think most of us know how the story ends, you know. David tells Saul that he did this thing, and Saul says, I'm so sorry. You know, you have been much better to me than I have been to you. And so Saul goes home, and David is spared for running from Saul for a little while. But anyway, the psalm was written with that as background. We don't know if it was written, you know, when he was hiding in the cave before Saul ever came in, or if it was after he released Saul. But this is when it was written. And it says, Have mercy on me, O God. Have mercy on me, for in you my soul takes refuge. I will take refuge in the shadow of your wings until the disaster has passed. I cry out to God Most High, to God who fulfills his purpose for me. He sends from heaven and saves me, rebuking those who hotly pursue me. God sends his love and his faithfulness. I am in the midst of lions. I lie among ravenous beasts, men whose teeth are spears and arrows, whose tongues are sharp swords. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. They spread a net for my feet. I was bowed down in distress. They dug a pit in my path, but they have fallen into it themselves. My heart is steadfast, O God. My heart is steadfast. I will sing and make music. Awake, my soul. Awake, harp and lyre. I will awake in the dawn. I will praise you, O Lord, among the nations. I will sing of you among the peoples. For great is your love, reaching to the heavens. Your faithfulness reaches to the skies. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. If you're like me, the song is playing in your head right now. Let your glory. Anyway, so yes, it's a great psalm, and it's one that I wish that I could have written during, you know, the hardest times in my life. I've never faced the reality of my life ending in as real of a way as David did for probably about 7 years when Saul was chasing him. And it obviously brings you a new dependence on God, because that's what you have. You know, the king of your nation is chasing you. How can you expect to escape? And it's so striking how, you know, Saul, the king, is chasing David, and yet he writes, "My refuge is in God Most High." You know, Saul may have all kinds of earthly power, but God is still Most High, and it is God's purposes that are going to be fulfilled. To God who fulfills His purpose for me, and that's a reassuring thing. You know, there are millions of people in the history of the world who have died because they did the right thing, and no one saw them but God. And somehow, God's purposes were fulfilled in their life. You know, we're not going to see that this side of heaven, but it doesn't negate the truth of it. We will see it someday. So, on to a little bit about the midst of lions and ravenous beasts. It's striking how often in the Psalms David talks about the tongue being a sword, and with all of the comparisons in Scripture about the tongue being a consuming fire, a sword. It's striking to me how often we underestimate the power of the tongue. You know, it is a really, really powerful weapon, or a really, really powerful instrument to build. I've been challenged in the last year or two. I've been listening to some Jordan Peterson, and he talks a lot about the importance of speaking the truth, of being accurate in what we say, not exaggerating, not building up our pride or speaking things that help to confirm what we already believe, things like that. You know, the truth is vital, and when we give up the truth, we sign ourselves up for destruction. You know, that's Satan's name. He's the father of lies. And even a lot of the Proverbs speak to this too. You know, when a nation or a people or an individual gives up speaking the truth, there's a whole lot of negative things that result from that. It's destructive. It's interesting, the end of the psalm is actually repeated in Psalm 108. The last 5 verses of Psalm 57 are the same as the first 5 verses of Psalm 108. So makes me wonder, if he had a little songbook and he, used some of the same choruses over and over. Just as a reminder to himself, it's not like we learn something and then we know it. We never have to learn it again. It feels like often we learn something, we have to learn it over and over and over. And how true is that when you have kids, right? How many times do you teach them the same thing over and over and over? But anyway, so this chorus is really encouraging, and it's fascinating how it comes. David talks about how all these people are chasing him and lying in wait for him, and their teeth are swords, and all of a sudden, my heart is steadfast, O God, my heart is steadfast. I will sing and make music. I will awaken the dawn. I will praise you, O Lord, among the nations. And I think one good thing about viewing God as a God of justice is that it forces people to take more responsibility for their actions. And it's easy for us now, I feel like, in this culture to view our circumstances as though they are a reflection on God's character, when often they're a reflection on our character. Some of them are from choices we make, but some of them, many of them, are from choices other people make too. So it's interesting to me how often people want to malign God and say, how could God allow this to happen? When it is a direct result of people sinning. I think the most painful things in life come from sin, not even just tragedy. It's difficult to maybe lose your parent in a landslide or something. But if you lose your parent as a result of them abandoning you, even more painful. You know, it's a wrong, it's an evil, and it's much more painful because of that. So anyway, in the midst of this, and in the midst of this terrible danger, he's praising God, and it's a lesson to us, and I think it's a gift we can give God. You know, when David says, "My heart is steadfast," my life is in danger, but my heart is steadfast because I know who you are, and I'm going to praise you no matter what. That is a gift we can give God, and it makes me think, you know, when God looks down and he sees his children, giving that kind of praise and honor to God in the middle of some very, very difficult circumstances, I have to think that has got to be one of the things that just gets him. You know, if when I see my kids doing something very, very difficult just because it's right, there's nothing that warms your heart like that. And so it is a gift we can give God, and it's a really special one. So that's my encouragement from Psalm 57. Psalm 58. I probably should start moving through these a little faster. Anyway, do you rulers indeed, this is more of a call to accountability, especially for rulers and for judges. Do you rulers indeed speak justly? Do you judge uprightly among men? No, in your heart you devise injustice, and your hands mete out violence on the earth. Even from birth the wicked go astray. From the womb they are wayward and speak lies. Their venom is like the venom of a snake, like that of a cobra that has stopped its ears, that will not heed the tune of the charmer, however skillful the enchanter may be. Break the teeth in their mouths, O God. Tear out, O Lord, the fangs of the lions. Let them vanish like water that flows away. When they draw the bow, let their arrows be blunted. Like a slug melting away as it moves along, like a stillborn child, may they not see the sun. Before your pots can feel the heat of the thorns, and by the way, thorns were a highly flammable, they would use dry thorns to start a fire really quickly. Before your pots can feel the heat of the thorns, so instantly, whether they be green or dry, the wicked will be swept away. The righteous will be glad when they are avenged, when they bathe their feet in the blood of the wicked. Then men will say, surely the righteous still are rewarded. Surely there is a God who judges the earth.
There was we actually need the Guyana movies, but we don't like. I'm done on Guyana now.
Okay, so when you both agree on, okay?
But Dad is not doing that.
Okay, well you tell him I told him he needs to, okay? Let's see. Can you tell the twins are napping, and Derek and Kinsley are watching a movie while I do this? Anyway, so back to Psalm 58. Just a couple things about this one. There is a lot of this stuff in the Psalms, and I think it's important to draw the distinction here between what's descriptive and what's prescriptive. You know, there's a lot of, especially the Old Testament, is mostly descriptive. It's history. It's telling you what happened, and it's, you know, this is basically David's diary. It's not saying that everything in the diary is correct and accurate. In the same way that Paul's letters to the churches, you know, they were more instructive. That was more prescriptive. This is what you should do. But a good bit of the Old Testament is more descriptive. This is what happened, and sometimes it will tell you what's right and wrong, but most of it is just history. And so I think it's really important to remember that when you read the Psalms, because there is a lot in the Psalms. I always think of Oleg's message, right, about all the vindictiveness in the Psalms. It's talking about, you know, how David, you know, wishes harm on his enemies, and I mean, there's some really awful pictures of the harm that he wishes on his enemies. And there's no question, you know, God talks about, I don't delight in the death of the wicked. It's not something that we should be glad. You know, we shouldn't be glad when we bathe our feet in the blood of the wicked, right? That's not how God feels about it. It's not how we should. But it is also true that when you believe in good and evil, and when you realize the devastation of evil, the more that you realize right and wrong and how wrong is, the more powerfully you're going to feel this kind of emotion. You're going to feel extreme anger and, justified anger at evil. And that's how God feels. I mean, he feels it on a much larger scale than we do. We have no conception of what it's like to be sinless. And still we get mad. when wrongs are done, and it doesn't even have to be to us. And that's how God feels about it. But we are still called to love, and even those that sin against us. I think there's something else I was going to say, but yeah, I mean it's a hard thing to not hate evil, especially when it's really evil. It's one thing to to lie about something that seems insignificant, and that's not saying it is insignificant, but it is less. It has far less devastating results usually than, for instance, the atrocities that you see in the Holocaust and in the Russian gulags. It's not that some sins are not bad, but some sins have much more devastating consequences for others. And so, while it's easy for us to justify our little sins because they're not as big as the big sins, it is true that we should try to avoid all sin as much as we can, and often that means kind of pushing away from the big sins. We get to the smaller ones. There are people that are closer to righteousness than other people because they tend to avoid the really destructive sins, and they start to correct the problems in their thinking, and so there aren't as many results from their actions that damage other people. So, yeah, that's kind of about a trail. But David does talk about, when God does bring justice on the earth, then people will know that He is God, and that there is a righteous judge, and that day is coming. When we see the horrific stuff that goes on in our world, in our own hearts, there is a day that's going to end, and the question is just whether we're ready for it. So our job is to be ready for it, first of all, and to do our absolute best to make sure that everyone else is ready for it too. So that's the end of the Psalms. And next we're going to move on to Proverbs. Proverbs 29. All right, now the Proverbs are always kind of a little hard to study because they're usually pretty unrelated, unless you're reading like a whole chapter that kind of has a theme and goes together, like at the beginning or the end. But most of them are just tiny little sayings, just all kind of stuck together. We did a study on Proverbs in our Sunday school class, and I separated them all out by topic, and that was a really interesting way to study it. It was fascinating to see what topics were covered the most. But we are doing Proverbs 29, so we're just going to go through them all, and I want you guys, as I read, to just think about what sticks out to you, and maybe what God's trying to tell you through it, and then I'll talk about what that got to me. So here we go. Proverbs 29. A man who remains stiff-necked after many rebukes will suddenly be destroyed, without remedy. When the righteous thrive, the people rejoice. When the wicked rule, the people groan. A man who loves wisdom brings joy to his father, but a companion of prostitutes squanders his wealth. By justice, a king gives a country stability, but one who's greedy for bribes tears it down. Whoever flatters his neighbor is spreading a net for his feet. An evil man is snared by his own sin, but a righteous one can sing and be glad. The righteous care about justice for the poor, but the wicked have no such concern. Mockers stir up a city, but wise men turn away anger. If a wise man goes to court with a fool, the fool rages and scoffs, and there's no peace. Bloodthirsty men hate a man of integrity and seek to kill the upright. A fool gives full vent to his anger, but a wise man keeps himself under control. If a ruler listens to lies, all his officials become wicked. The poor man and the oppressor have this in common: the Lord gives sight to the eyes of both. If a king judges the poor with fairness, his throne will always be secure. The rod of correction imparts wisdom, but a child left to himself disgraces his mother. When the wicked thrive, so does sin, but the righteous will see their downfall. Discipline your son, and he will give you peace. He will bring delight to your soul. Sorry. Where there is no revelation, the people cast off restraint, but blessed is he who keeps the law. A servant cannot be corrected by mere words. Though he understands, he will not respond. If you see a man who speaks in haste, there's more hope for a fool than for him. If a man pampers his servant from youth, he will bring grief in the end. An angry man stirs up dissension, and a hot-tempered one commits many sins. A man's pride brings him low, but a man of lowly spirit gains honor. The accomplice of a thief is his own enemy. He's put under oath and dare not testify. Fear of man will prove to be a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord is kept safe. Many seek an audience with a ruler, but it is from the Lord that man gets justice. The righteous detest the dishonest. The wicked detest the upright. Seeing a little bit of that in our country right now. All right, so I don't know what stuck out to you, but some of the things that stuck out to me were the commands for rulers, because we just talked about that in Psalms. So I'll read the Proverbs that apply to rulers again. Verse 2, when the righteous thrive, the people rejoice. When the wicked rule, the people groan. 4, by justice a king gives a country stability, but one who is greedy for bribes tears it down. And this was always it's always been a problem. But, I can think of a couple different instances in the Old Testament where it talks about judges being greedy for bribes, and even Absalom, David's own son, he, would sit out by the gates and catch everybody who was coming in to bring a complaint to the king, and would say, oh, the king's too busy to hear you, but if I was king, I would do it better. So that kind of corruption and injustice has significant effects, and God speaks strongly against it. Solomon, obviously, as a king, knew the kind of damage that an unjust ruler or judge could do. It sounds so blanket when you just say injustice, but when you say, there was a widow and she lost her land because somebody moved the boundary lines. Back then they didn't have GPS and surveyors and permanent records of things, and it was a whole lot it seems like it would have been a little easier for somebody to break the law and to steal what wasn't theirs, and in so doing to impoverish someone completely. I mean, when somebody takes everything you have, it's devastating for you and for anyone that you're responsible for taking care of. It wasn't just adults that had to deal with this. It was children, and the repercussions of that go on for generations. Another verse, 7. The righteous care about justice for the poor, but the wicked have no such concern. This is a good measuring stick to measure ourselves by. Do we care about justice for the poor? Do we want them to, do we work toward giving them opportunities and making sure that they don't get stolen from or taken advantage of? Verse 12. If a ruler listens to lies, all of his officials become wicked. And you can see how this happens, right? I mean, it happens anywhere, but when a ruler does it, then it's much worse, because they have that power over other people, and all of a sudden, the whole country's in big trouble. Verse 14, if a king judges the poor with fairness, his throne will always be secure. Your character is something that is really, really valuable. It's one of the reasons that a tongue can be so damaging, because people can destroy your reputation unfairly. But if you do the right thing and you do it often and you're consistent in it, people will see that and they spread the word. It's not just the wealthy and the powerful that that decide the fate of a nation. It's the people who are down at the grassroots, the people that aren't necessarily the people that you would go to for power. All right, and the last verse, 26, many seek an audience with a ruler, but it is from the Lord that man gets justice. Isn't that interesting? After all these verses encouraging rulers to be just, it's from the Lord that man gets justice. And isn't that true? I mean, we can make laws and we can try and enforce them, but ultimately, God is the only one who sees everything that happens, and he's the only one that can judge correctly. And he's certainly the only one that can give justice, that can actually repay you for the things that you've lost. Because, you know, when injustice happens, you lose something. So it's not that, you know, it's unlikely that the person that committed the wrong against you is ever going to be able to make it right, to make it as though it never happened. But when we give that to God, and when we release the need for revenge, when we expect justice from God and God alone, then he can use it for good in a way that no one else can. Another one that stuck out to me, just because it made me think, was whoever flatters his neighbor is spreading a net for his feet. And this goes back a little bit to what we were talking about, about speaking the truth, but it's a sin that is pretty common in our day. You know, it's easy to flatter. It's especially easy to flatter somebody that we want to think well of us. And flattery is defined as what? Excessive, or I looked it up, excessive and insincere praise. I think that's what it is. So it's easy to say nice lies to somebody's face and to, you know, try and puff up their ego so that maybe they give us something we want, or so that they, you know, well, usually so they give us something we want. But it is wrong, and you're actually damaging them when you do that. We don't often think of lying nicely as a problem, but it is. You know, when if somebody would come up to me and you know, I would rather, in our marriage, I would rather that Josh tell me the truth than that he just lie to my face, and you know, it sounds nice, and I'm like, oh great, you know, I'm not having a problem with this, I'm a good person, and then I end up losing all my friends because none of them want to be around me because I'm acting like a jerk in some way. Yeah, it's actually destructive to somebody when you just flatter them, when you say something nice about them, but it's not true, and you know it's not true. So yes, just watch what we say. And the last section that kind of stuck out to me, because I'm a parent, obviously, right now, and parenting very young children, was about discipline. So there were a bunch of verses about that. A man who remains stiff-necked after many rebukes will suddenly be destroyed without remedy. And this is a good reason to discipline. This is my motivation. You know, I don't want my kids growing up and experiencing the negative results of bad choices. And eventually they will experience negative consequences. And they will probably be given out by somebody who loves them much less than I do. So I want to teach them early on, you know, to listen to rebukes and to correct their behavior when it's wrong, so that they don't have to experience this suddenly being destroyed without remedy. You know, there is a point when it all crashes down and you're stuck in jail the rest of your life or something because of repeated bad choices. Next verse was 15. The rod of correction imparts wisdom, but a child left to himself disgraces his mother. It would be a disgraced mother. But again, it's a rod of correction. It's not a rod of punishment. The goal here is to correct the behavior, to motivate your children to do better. It's not to just make them feel terrible over what they've done. I mean, that's probably a part of it, but it can't end there. If it ends there, then all they do is feel terrible about all they've done, and they probably just keep doing it. So the point is to correct. Okay. 17. Discipline your son, and he will give you peace. He will bring delight to your soul. I think that is pretty self-explanatory. 19. Now, the last two verses are actually about servants, not children. But they do apply to children too, so I'm going to go ahead and read them. A servant cannot be corrected by mere words. Though he understands, he will not respond. If any of you remember having young children, you know this is true. You know, you can sit down and talk to your kids till you're blue in the face, but until they start experiencing some consequences, the behavior is probably not going to change. And the last verse, 21. If a man pampers his servant from youth, he will bring grief in the end. So, again, you don't want to pamper your kids. You're doing them a disservice. They're not learning to stand on their own 2 feet. They're not learning the truth about the world. They're not learning the truth about where their actions will take them when they do make choices, things like that. So anyway, as we finish up our lesson, I just wanted to bring out a few things. First of all, that God never commands unimportant things. Every piece of wisdom that he gives us is specifically intended for our good. And it's if we disregard that at our peril. He doesn't make pointless rules. He knows he created the world. He knows how it runs best. And it's not a small thing when we decide that we know better and decide to go our own way. There are consequences, and we'll probably never see all of them. You know, it's easy to look back at some of the mistakes that biblical characters made and see the awful repercussions and think, why on earth did they ever do that? But the fact is, you know, a couple generations down the line, a decision that I make that may not seem all that devastating to me may have some serious consequences for my descendants. And it's a reminder that what we do is important. Every decision that I make today has an eternal impact. When it comes to, you know, not probably brushing my teeth or something, but you know, the moral decisions, whether I decide to discipline my kids or to speak the truth or how to discipline my kids. It is very, very important. And you know, Moses and David and Solomon, all there. You know, we know these names and we know everything that they did as important, but nothing that we do is less important. It just hasn't. We live a little later, so we're not part of the Bible, but it doesn't mean that our choices do not carry the same weight that theirs did. So I just want to encourage you in that and to challenge you. Don't underestimate the difference that one person can make in the world. See you next week.